Hi and welcome to this insect photography video. Today I'm going to be using this lens, which is the Canon 100mm macro f2.8, and I'm going to be out in the field specifically photographing insects handheld using natural light. If you're a subscriber, then welcome back. If you're new to this channel, then click the subscribe button for plenty of nature photography videos, tips and techniques. In terms of weather conditions, bright sun like this can be perfectly fine for insect photography. The only thing is it tends to make the insects more active, so I'd also consider photographing on more overcast days. The main thing that you want to look for is low winds. So today is definitely much windier than I'd like it to be. But if you can get out on a day when the winds are lower, then it's just going to make everything much easier. So I often use Aperture Priority for this kind of photography, and the reason being that it just gives you a little bit less to think about. So getting close to insects in the field is often not an easy thing to do. So if you use Aperture Priority, the exposure is going to look after itself, just gives you a little bit less to think about. So I'll often use apertures between f5.6 and f8 quite commonly. And what I'll usually do is start with a wider aperture when I'm further away, say f5.6, and then when I've decided I can get closer to the insect, once I move in, I'll actually reduce the aperture maybe to f8, f11, sometimes even less if I can actually do it. And the reason for that is that as you get closer to the insect, as you move in, the depth of field naturally becomes less. So if you want to get that nice depth of field throughout the whole body of the insect, then as you get closer, it's a good idea to reduce the aperture. Now you might need to add a little bit of exposure compensation, particularly with white subjects. So for example, the small and large white butterflies, or anything that's just very light toned. And the situation, it will depend how much you need to adjust the compensation. But a good idea is, if you've got time, just check on the back of the camera and see if you need to add possibly some underexposure, or in some cases even some overexposure. When you've found an insect and you want to get closer, just try and do everything as smoothly and slowly as you can. I like to use this technique as well. Once I've got myself roughly into photographable position, but I still want to get closer, this is what I tend to do. So rather than just kind of reach forward with my body, which is going to be less stable, I'll slowly put one foot forward and then use that as a pivot. So I'll slowly put one foot forward, maybe a couple of feet, and then from that I can just use it as a pivot to move forward. And that's really good because you can actually move forward and back really smoothly and very stable as well. Also, as you approach, do try to bear in mind where the sun is, and you want to make sure that you don't cast a shadow from your body or from the camera onto the subject. In terms of shutter speed, now I am using Aperture Priority, but I'm still going to keep a check on the shutter speed. So I'm basically just going to keep glancing as I look through the viewfinder. I'm going to just keep glancing at the shutter speed that I'm getting, and I'm quite happy to shoot around 1/250th of a second, preferably faster. This is actually the non-IS version of this lens, no image stabilization, so I'm happy to shoot around 1/250th, and I don't really want the shutter speed to go below about 200th of a second. As for your ISO setting, you can set that manually or you can use auto ISO if you prefer. What I tend to do is actually set it manually. So I'll start off just to give me that shutter speed that I'm after, and then if the light changes, for example it clouds over and the light levels drop, then I'll just put the ISO, maybe I'll double the ISO just to maintain the same shutter speed. I would suggest setting the camera to a continuous shooting mode. So rather than just taking one picture at a time, take a burst of frames. So it doesn't have to be super high. I would say if you set the camera to maybe 3 or 4 frames a second, and then when you've got everything nicely framed and focused, fire off a short burst of shots. And that's just going to increase the chances of one of those images being absolutely pin sharp. So what about focusing? What's the best way to focus in this style of photography? Well, I tend to use two methods. So the first is to actually use the tracking autofocus, the AI servo on the Canon. So if it's quite strong light and the insects are more active, then I'll tend to go for the autofocus, and that helps to keep the insect in focus as it's moving around. Alternatively, you can use the manual focus approach, which is the one that I tend to prefer most of the time myself. I'll probably use this particularly when the insects are less active. So a bit earlier in the morning, or it's a little bit cooler, more overcast, the insects aren't moving around quite as much and I've got a bit more time. And then the technique I use with manual focus is one where I get the insect framed up how I want it, and I get it focused roughly, and then I actually move back and forth with the camera to focus. So rather than keep moving the focus ring, I actually hold the camera and slightly rock back and forth. And that's a really good technique. If you haven't tried that one, give it a go. Now, I think lens hoods are actually really good things. They can stop lens flare, and they also help to protect the front of the lens. The only problem in this style of photography with insects and macro photography is that sometimes you can actually get so close that the lens hood can start to get in the way. So just bear that in mind. If you get very close, there is a chance that it can start to block the light and actually cast a shadow, or maybe it's interfering with some of the surrounding foliage or plant stems. So I'd start with the lens hood on, and then if you have any of those problems, just simply take it off. One of the most important things with this type of photography is actually in trying to keep the back of the camera as parallel as you can to the subject. So what that means is you really have to think about your shooting angle. So when you approach the insect, try and see if you can maneuver yourself so that the back of the camera is nice and flat towards the insect. So for example, if there was say a hoverfly or a butterfly resting on the top of a flower, rather than shoot from here, for example, maybe what seems a natural and more comfortable position, you maybe want to think about actually trying to get higher and getting right above the subject. And if you do that, it's going to keep the back of the camera nice and parallel. That's going to maximise your depth of field throughout the whole of the body of the insect. However, if you find a butterfly on top of the flower and it's actually resting with its wings closed, then you're probably going to be better shooting directly from the side. Lenses such as this 100mm macro are absolutely perfect for this, and they are designed to do the job, but there are other options out there. So one suggestion is something I used to do before I had the macro lens, was to actually use a shorter focal length and match it up with an extension tube. So if you've got something like an 80mm or possibly even a standard 50mm lens, you could actually put an extension tube on that. It just goes between the lens and the body, and it just allows you to focus closer. So that's one way of getting into the field of macro photography without actually purchasing a macro lens. Another option is if you've got a telephoto lens, something like a 300mm, then you could use that with an extension tube as well. And the benefit of that is you're going to get really nice soft backgrounds, but if you add the extension tube to it, then it'll just reduce the minimum focusing distance and you'll be able to get the insect larger in the frame. If you want to learn more about nature and wildlife photography, then do click the subscribe button for plenty of tutorials and tips and techniques from me, Miguel. So I'll see you somewhere in nature sometime soon.